Okay, if we're going to go right now into the next series of panels, we're going to be looking at sort of along Nick's lines of covering the Pennsylvania more specifically. The next panel is entitled, Can Pennsylvania Continue Leading America to Energy Independence and Abundance? And I'm going to hand it over to my friend and colleague, Andre, to take it away. So good luck to you. Do you need this microphone, or should I?
No, I think we'll be better as we wait for the panel to assemble here. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad there was a buffer between us and lunch, so hopefully everyone is now reinvigorated. That was an excellent talk by Nick, and we think a good kickoff to where we are now. First, I'd like to thank Andrew and the Drake Energy Security Forum for allowing the Commonwealth Foundation to be a great partner and sponsor of this event, which we are happy to be. My name is Andre Beliveau. I'm the Senior Manager of Energy Policy for the Commonwealth Foundation, which is a free market think tank here in Pennsylvania. And we're going to do some scene setting. We've heard a lot about scene setting this morning. So we're going to do a real quick scene set, and then I'm going to introduce our panel, and then we're going to get into the conversation that we're going to have here. So I just think a couple things, sort of reflecting on this morning into now. So we'll get sort of the flashy stuff out of the way first. So I'm going to, and no disrespect, again, we're here in dialogue and conversation, so no disrespect to any of our commentators this morning or panelists, but I'm going to submit that there is absolutely no such thing as clean energy. That is a phrase that we like to say, but it is absolutely, in the way that the phrase clean energy is intended and how it's usually used, that's just not true. We have reliable energy, and we have unreliable energy. And that reliable and unreliable energy can be affordable, or it can be expensive. We have energy that emits carbon, or has other sorts of emissions, and we have energy that doesn't. We have baseload energy. We have energy that's dispatchable, and we have intermittent sources of energy. But there's no actual such thing as clean energy. Even when they say that, they tend to be talking about things like wind and solar, which ignores the fact of what we just heard before, that these are carbon-intensive things. You need the very basic petroleum products and the fossil fuels to make the wind turbines, to make the solar panels, and as we heard earlier, the rare earth minerals that come from fracking is what can actually be used to make the battery technology. So this is actually in an energy environment. There is a symbiosis here between hydrocarbons and renewable energy sources, between reliable, unreliable sources, between those that can run on their own power and those who are weather-dependent intermittent sources. There's just different kinds of energy, but there's no such thing, and again, the way it's meant as clean energy. So I think that's important for us to set the stage here. Just the terms matter. And at the Commonwealth Foundation, we find ourselves, there's also been a lot of talk about the term energy transition. That's certainly true, I think, when we think about policy. But what's really before us is not so much an energy transition, but rather an energy crossroads. And that we find ourselves in a crossroads, not just in the United States, but I think in the globe, where we see several pathways at this crossroads. And depending on the policies that are implemented, not only here in Pennsylvania, but also in Washington, D.C., and in other places, we are going to see a pathway of one that leads to energy abundance and the sustainability of modern life and leading into the future, and an energy pathway that takes us towards energy scarcity or energy poverty. And I think that all energy resources can be a part of either one of those directions, but that is certainly the place that we find ourselves in. We find ourselves in a crossroads between abundance and energy poverty and scarcity. And that brings us to Pennsylvania. And when we're thinking about energy abundance versus energy poverty or scarcity, can Pennsylvania continue leading America to energy independence and energy abundance? I would argue that Pennsylvania is not only the keystone state, but I do think we are the keystone to American energy security. We are the second largest producer of natural gas in the country. We're the largest net power exporter in Pennsylvania. And also, we have the second largest nuclear fleet, second only to Illinois. I know we're going to talk about nuclear on this panel as well. So with that, we're going to try to answer this question: can Pennsylvania continue leading America to energy independence and abundance? And with that, I have a stellar panel here to help us answer that question. So I'll introduce the panel, starting first to my right and then moving along. We have Alex Charlton. Alex is the Senior Manager of State Government Affairs for Constellation Energy. Here we have my think tank colleague here, Paige Lambermont, who's a research fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. We heard from her earlier, and we have Stephanie Wissman, who is the Executive Director for Pennsylvania for API, the American Petroleum Institute, and all the way down at the end, we have Arthur Stewart, who is the President of Cameron Energy, and also a board member for the Pennsylvania Grade Crude Oil Coalition. So thank you all for agreeing to be on this panel. And I guess we'll start with whoever has, so Paige has a microphone, we'll start with Paige. I'm gonna have each of the panelists sort of address the question and take a minute and a half, 2 minutes to sort of best answer this question. And then I hope we can just sort of have an organic conversation from wherever y'all lead us. So Paige, our question, take it away.
Thanks, Andre. So in order to achieve energy abundance, a place needs a few things. You need natural resources, you need the capacity to use those natural resources, and you need a government that's going to allow you to do so. Pennsylvania is incredibly blessed in the natural resources department. Oil, gas, rivers, forests, everything you could possibly need to be able to use resources well. And Pennsylvania also has incredible history of industry and incredibly well-developed industries that have people working in them that know what they're doing and will be able to expand well over time as opportunities present themselves. The problem for Pennsylvania is a governance problem. And the problem exists across the country, but Pennsylvania's particular issues tend to be in the bureaucracy department in terms of high energy taxes, bureaucratic red tape preventing producers from making the energy that they'd like to make, and a business climate that's somewhat inflationary and harder to operate in sometimes. It's true for a lot of states, but it's one of the bigger problems for Pennsylvania right now. And then there's also, of course, the national policy implications. You've got the power plant rule, which is going to close all coal and many natural gas plants by the 2030s. You've got things like the Inflation Reduction Act subsidies that are going into place and allowing wind and solar to sort of dominate on the grid in ways that push more reliable capacity to be less economically successful. And all of those are going to be challenges that Pennsylvania faces in achieving energy abundance. But there's also tons of positives. Right now, AI energy demand is going to provide significant opportunities for new energy to come onto the grid. And the energy, right now, the AI and the internet in general are pretty much physically located in Virginia. Almost all of the internet capacity and data center capacity in the United States is in Virginia right now. And Virginia is kind of signaling that it's near capacity on what it wants to house in terms of AI capacity. So Pennsylvania has a great opportunity both to house future AI capacity and to power Virginia's capacity. And so what that means is that if we are able to create a business environment that encourages new power plant construction, there will be money to meet that construction. And so creating a situation in which it is economically beneficial to build those new power plants will easily meet this challenge.
Sure. So I'm Arthur Stewart. I have a conventional oil and gas business just about 40 miles from here. We grew from 0 wells when I jumped into the business 40 years ago to pumping about 1,800 wells now. We employ about 50 people. We're small. We're like the family farm of energy. Overall, I produce about 250,000 barrels equivalent of oil a year, which is tiny because we consume 20 million barrels a day in the country. So you can see what a speck we are in the big picture. Nevertheless, I think we're the canary in the coal mine in terms of warning about operations in Pennsylvania. My operations have obviously always been in Pennsylvania, and I'll tell you that we're finding it hard to survive the last 15 years. Before I tell you why it's hard to survive, let me distinguish between us in the conventional and the unconventional realm. Until 20 years ago, there was no unconventional oil and gas production. Everything was conventional, just like Drake's Well to the east of us here, just a couple hundred yards. And go out and look at the pictorial just to the right of the door here. It will explain to you what the difference is between conventional and unconventional. Conventional wells are drilled into the storage zones where oil and gas migrated millions of years ago after it was formed in the deeper layers, which was the shale. And the shale is what's been tapped now in the last 20 years. Out here it's called the source rock. So we should be cognizant that the great change here has been by drilling into the source rock, which ought to be a little bit frightening to us, I suppose, because we've already tapped the storage zones. Now we're tapping the source rock. So it tells us, it reminds us that energy is precious and there are limitations on that precious energy. So to wrap up my story about the canary in the gold mine, we were the only oil and gas production in the world until 20 years ago. And now with the advent of unconventional, there are some pressures that are chasing us out of business in Pennsylvania. I'll give you a statistic that should be frightening. Up until the advent of the shale in Pennsylvania, we were drilling about 4,000 to 5,000 new conventional oil and gas wells in Pennsylvania every year. That has dropped down to about 200 wells a year, and it's been on a steady decline for the last 15 years. I jotted down some 5 reasons. I'll just make sure I give them all to you. I'm in total agreement. Top of the list is policy changes in Pennsylvania. The regulations are killing us. We've been combined with the regulations for unconventional. They just don't fit our industry, and so the big bureaucratic machine doesn't care enough to recognize that difference, and so it's squeezed us out of business. The subsidies are hurting us. Wind and solar, what I'll call the unreliables, are subsidized 6 times greater than any subsidies that flow to oil and gas. I've never received a penny in subsidies. Next is limitation on capital. My bank stopped lending to us because of the ESG movement. Lawfare. I can't think of a time in the last 15 years when I haven't been involved in litigation, either on my own company's behalf or on behalf of the Pennsylvania Great Crude Coalition, which I co-founded 12 years ago. Some of those would have put us out of business. Had we lost, I'm involved in 2 right now. I fight entities like the one right now is the Clean Air Council, the Environmental Defense Fund, those kinds of groups. And last but not least would be the low price of natural gas. Probably the greatest example of that was the kick in the pants that we got in January when the change came for the export terminal policy. When President Biden imposed that, natural gas prices dropped in half. And so for my little company, we can't afford to hedge and do a lot of things that majors can do. Again, we don't have access to capital. So our response is either lay people off, cut back over time, those kinds of things. So that's why I say we're the canary in the gold mine. My industry's in deep trouble. Supply stores have closed. There's just not many of us left in the industry. And frankly, that's where energy in Pennsylvania is headed. We're just ahead of the game.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for coming out today and to sort of answer Andre's question. I think Pennsylvania is well positioned to be a leader in our energy future. We have been the leader in energy for centuries in this country, with coal, with oil, with gas, the first commercial nuclear reactor. And I think that as we look towards the future, those are all still viable for us. And as we're moving forward and looking at our energy productivity, the sandbox is growing, and we didn't see this happening 5 or 10 years ago, and we saw energy demand being relatively stagnant, maybe some small incremental increases, but being offset by energy efficiencies. But however, with large-scale electrification, with vehicles, with appliances, buildings, and the explosive growth of the AI industry and data centers, there's a significant jump in that energy demand, and that's creating new opportunities for a lot of different partners in the fields. And I think what it comes down to is the partnerships, and it's going to be the industries working together. It's going to be the legislature, the administration working together, working with the industries, and creating an environment that entices those businesses to be in Pennsylvania. We are certainly in competition with other states. While we have some significant advantages, those advantages can be compensated for by other states with other incentives. So we can't pretend that just the natural resources that we have are going to be good enough. And we need to be aggressive in being competitive in bringing those growth opportunities to Pennsylvania.
Okay. All right, to answer your question also, Andre, absolutely. I think Pennsylvania can lead in the energy space, and I'm going to tell you why. Because of the shale revolution that came online around 15 years ago, that is the reason why the United States is the #1 producer of natural gas and oil, because of the technologies of horizontal drilling combined with hydraulic fracturing. Hydraulic fracturing has been around over 60 years, so that's not necessarily a new technology, but when you combine it with horizontal drilling, that's how you get down beneath the ground to those natural gas and oil resources that were they were unreachable until the technology and the innovation caught up and we were able to get tapped down into that. So I want to go in a direction too, because energy it impacts our modern way of life. Without natural gas and oil, we would not be able to lead the lives that we do today. And it's everything from what we're wearing to our iPhones, to the shoes, the eyes, the pharmaceuticals, everything. I would challenge you to tell me something that you do in your daily life that is not impacted by natural gas and oils, those derivatives that allow you to have that modern way. And I'm not the only one that says this, okay? The electorate also feels that way. They also feel and know the importance of energy. So Andre, we also did a poll back in August. API, we commissioned a poll, Morning Consult did it for us. And the poll that we conducted, we looked at all of the top 6 battleground states for the presidential race. And this was bipartisan, it was Republicans, Democrats, Independents, and equal sampling in those 6 states. And in Pennsylvania in particular, 91% of voters in Pennsylvania agree that inflation is their #1 issue, okay? But then when you delve deeper into that, 83% said, we believe access to energy will help us keep inflation down, okay? And then 85% of the respondents said to us, we need to know more about the energy policy supported by both Vice President Harris and former President Trump. So energy is definitely on the minds of the electorate and would-be voters. So that's very important. So what we've done at API, it's like, how can we preserve our enviable position of being an energy superpower in the world? So we unveiled back in June a 5-point policy roadmap that we have been talking to Congress about, the administration, as well as at the state level in Pennsylvania. So these are the 5 points that we've covered. One is, in order to reduce inflation and to keep us energy secure and to remain, as I said, an energy superpower, we got to make sure we protect consumer choice. So when you talk about electric vehicles as an example, government, don't tell me I have to drive an EV. If I want to drive one, that's great, but don't tell me to do that. Protect my choice on how I cook my food, gas stove or electric stove. Don't tell me how I should heat my home, natural gas or electric, as an example. So that's a big issue that we're talking about on how we can preserve our energy advantage that we have here in Pennsylvania and in the world. Secondly, it's access. We need more access to our natural gas and oil reserves, so allow us to produce those resources. Third is permitting reform, and that's something that's going to come up again and again because it's that critical. We need permitting reform across the board, whether you're talking about energy infrastructure projects or getting your permits to get a new well drilled. That's what you're looking at there. Sensible tax policy. Don't instill punitive tax policy just for the sake of that, because it's definitely going to disincentivize things. And then lastly, geopolitical strength. We need to continue to be a leader in liquefied natural gas exports. We are the #1 LNG export in the world, and we've even surpassed countries like Qatar, which we never thought we would see in our lifetime. So those are the 5 points that we are carrying to DC as well as to the states, including Pennsylvania, because all of these are easily transferable from a policy perspective from the federal level to the states.
It's great. Well, thank you all for that. Everyone's different perspective. It's really, I think it's great to hear how all of this inevitably comes together and what role Pennsylvania can play. We've been talking a lot about public policy and how those things impact not just now in all of your responses, but throughout the day. And when we think about the policy landscape nationally, we do see that there's definitely a clear direction where government is wanting to pick winners and losers. We see this through whether it's direct, might not be direct, it might be ways like through the Inflation Reduction Act, where you subsidize the market in such a way where we end up poisoning and how we do our energy markets and disrupting price signals. Arthur, you mentioned the IRA. So when we look at this policy landscape in different ways where policy and regulation is impacting not just American energy security, but Pennsylvania's role, in that. What are some of the top, in your different areas? I mean, Paige, if you want to start, just because you mentioned about the grid and how the internet lives in Virginia. Virginia might not have been in the internet, but it's living there currently. And why does that matter to us? Obviously, we've got the PJM grid, but then I'll pass on to everybody else. What are some of the regulatory burdens and policy implications that are most threatening Pennsylvania from unlocking its full economic potential in the energy space?
Yeah, for sure. So I wrote a paper over the summer called How to Keep the Lights On, 9 principles for policymakers on the electrical grid. And most of the essential points are things like making sure that states don't keep renewable portfolios standards in place or join RGGI. There are things like making sure we don't put the power plant rule into effect, avoiding premature nuclear closures. And at the time, I didn't think to include the idea that we could reopen closed nuclear plants, but that's fun and exciting. Yeah, basically, stewarding the power resources that we have, especially the thermal units that are reliable. Preventing premature closures of plants that work is like thing number one. I mean, PJM is going to lose 58 gigawatts of thermal capacity by 2030. And something has to replace that. And so it's ensuring that the permitting to replace that is an easy process. And that it's a fast process, because if too much red tape stands in the way, either the data or the capacity that's needed to meet data center demand won't come online, or it'll come online somewhere else and we'll squander the opportunity here. So it's about ensuring, that we're able to build the new and exciting things.
So we heard it this morning, and that is the water that's produced with oil and gas. It happens around the world, and you have to get rid of that water. Pennsylvania has an incredibly rigid and unhelpful attitude toward that from a regulatory perspective, and so that's devastating not only to my conventional industry, but also to the unconventional industry. There was legislation passed. In fact, Senator Hutchinson, who's here, was a co-author of that legislation back in 2015 that started a group in 2016, an advisory council that is supposed to solve Pennsylvania's water problem. During that time, from the passage of the legislation until now, the number of places where you can dispose of water legally in Pennsylvania has decreased by 85%, not increased. So we go to these meetings with the regulatory folks, and you find an incredible, I said it before, rigidity, but I'll say it again. I'll give you an example. The amount of radioactive material that's in a tank of water, 140 barrels of water that comes out with our oil and gas, you separate the water and it sits over here, is about the same amount that's in a smoke detector. And yet we treat the smoke detector as something we can throw away in the garbage, and we treat the 140 barrels of water as though we have to have a radioactive nuclear suit around it. It's just, the degree of ridiculousness is preventing new drilling in both industries, conventional and unconventional.
Yeah, I'll tackle that real quick too. Infrastructure, in one word, is a real regulatory burden, and it's a big obstacle for our industry right now. I mean, it shouldn't take a shorter amount of time to get a four-year college degree than to get a permit for an energy project. And that's what we are seeing, that time and time again. It shouldn't take an act of Congress to approve an interstate pipeline. And that's what you had with the IRA and the Mountain Valley Pipeline that went through West Virginia to Virginia. But that's the reality right now. And that's why infrastructure, permitting reform, and I would even go and say that we need legal reform, because everywhere you turn with pipeline projects and other energy projects, there is a group that is, filing a lawsuit against it for any reason under the sun that you can imagine. And there's no limits on how many times they can come back and stall a project. So I would say not only is infrastructure reform needed, obviously permitting reform, but legal reform in that area as well.
And I want to touch on something that Paige had mentioned about preservation of existing resources being as important as they are. In 2018, then Exelon, we were under a heavy effort to try and preserve 3 Mile Island Unit 1 from having to shut it down because of economic factors. There's nothing wrong with the plant operationally. In fact, it's one of the safest plants in the country up until we had to shut it down. And we had warned the legislature, the administration, and the public that shutting this down was going to be costly. And this was going to be a cost burden by everyone in the PJM market. And then there was I had to look it up here to make sure I got it right. The Joint State Government Commission did a review of the value of nuclear and future nuclear opportunities. And one of the lines in here is one of my favorites. TMI's closure was a preventable and potentially wasteful use of Pennsylvania's existing energy infrastructure, and it is unlikely to be repeated. Lord, I hope so. Because as we're talking about this massive growth in energy demand, the last thing we want to see is another one of our nuclear plants being forced offline for reasons other than the life expectancy being met of the plant. So preserving the existing facilities is critical, and encouraging the growth of those facilities should be supported.
Good.
So I think a lot of the time the wind and solar subsidies are treated as kind of like a harmless throwaway that just will allow this new technology to flourish maybe, and we should try it. The problem is that it throws off the entire economics of everything else on the grid. A lot of the premature nuclear closures that we've seen are because of them becoming uneconomical, and it's because of the way that RTOs are structured. If wind and solar on the grid are given extra credits on top of every bid that they put into the system, then reliable nuclear and reliable natural gas won't be able to compete, and you'll only realize the problem once those things are gone.
Yeah, so let's talk about that a little bit more, just about the idea of grid diversification. So first off, we had the idea. What is the benefit of adding intermittency as part of a diversified grid as opposed to? So let's just talk about that. Let's talk about the differences between baseload, dispatchability, and intermittency, and what that looks like as part of a diversified grid. Let's just talk about that.
I'll start. So the energy demand is not flat, it's not linear, right? Not throughout a minute, not throughout an hour, not throughout a day. There's constant fluctuations. And when you look at the sources of energy that are being provided out there, there are some like coal and nuclear that are pretty flat. They're just running. They're always humming along. Nuclear in particular, we have a 90% and upward rate of runtime, so we are essentially always online. If you think about one of the facilities currently existing in Pennsylvania, they're all producing about 2 gig, a little bit more, at any second of the day. And we really don't throttle that down. The only time they come down is when they need to have maintenance done, and that's usually every 18 months. So that's your base load power. It's providing everything that you need to supply that base level of energy that is needed. Now, throughout the day, and particularly during particular seasons, if you're looking at the summer, you're going to see a peak during the day when air conditioners are kicked on, when people are in their offices, and that's where you can have the other sources of energy are ramping up, whereas nuclear doesn't ramp. We're kind of at a pretty steady state. You're going to see gas things, you're going to see renewables being able to kind of fill those voids and being able to fill the gaps that are needed. Subsequently, or conversely, in the winter time, you're going to see demands at night for gas, for electric, as heat increases, as people want to continue to heat their homes as the nights go colder. So while you're looking at these waves of energy demand, you need to have a grid that's able to complement those waves of energy. As much as I love nuclear energy, and as much as I would love to see a full nuclear energy grid, it's not realistic. It would provide way too much given most of the time demand. But the reality is that there's a need for a competent mix of energy resources to ensure that you're either not running short of the demand that you need, or not dumping excess energy off into the grid that just goes to waste. Because that's just, either way, those are costs to consumers that are completely unnecessary. And to do it from one resource is an unreliable expectation. So you really do need that diversity of energy to ensure that you have that complement out there. And I would even say that, you know, if you were to relying too much on one source of energy, you are hindering those other sources because you're giving one market player probably too much of a market share, which gives them a bit too much of an opportunity to depress prices and force the competition out. So there really is an important value to having a diversity of resources.
And just for kind of everyone's knowledge, the Pennsylvania electrical grid is about 86% natural gas and nuclear, so that's your baseload nuclear and your dispatchable natural gas making up the vast majority, and there's 10% coal in there, and then the remainder is renewables. So it's in very large part the grid is baseload nuclear and baseload coal with natural gas dispatchable to make up that difference.
Yeah, and just one more thing to add to that too in regard to the diversity of the portfolio. So it used to be a third in Pennsylvania. It used to be a third coal, a third natural gas, and a third nuclear, and a very small percentage of renewables. So now that's changed. Paige, kind of what you alluded to, natural gas is now the largest share in the generation portfolio here in Pennsylvania, followed by nuclear, followed by coal, and then renewables are right around there too. And I totally agree. I think we need a diversified portfolio without a doubt. But I am concerned, and maybe we're going to talk about PJM a little bit more here, but PJM as well as the legislature here in Pennsylvania has sounded the alarm saying, hey, unless we do something here, folks, we have too many baseload plants that are coming offline, and again, PJM is the wholesale grid there. They're the ones who, I equate it to kind of like the air traffic controller, directing all that wholesale energy to points where it needs to go. But they are saying because of all the retirements of baseload power and the fact that 98% of the energy projects that are in the PJM queue to come online are renewables. These are intermittent sources. And we have nothing to replace right now baseload power. So if nothing is done, we're looking at 2030 having rolling blackouts, not being able to put the lights on. So it's a real problem. And this is something that I think policymakers can weigh in with PJM and really put some pressure on them to say, you got to move these baseload projects up to the top of the queue here because we can't make it with 98% intermittent sources. We want to make sure we have reliable, secure energy, and if it keeps going the way it's going now, we're not going to have that.
And just one quick follow-up to that. So what is the role of, and Paige and I have talked about this a little bit. So if we want to keep the lights on and prevent rolling blackouts, then how much, we talk about overbuilding, underbuilding, I think we all agree that you don't want one type of source, but you would appreciate the fact that they should all be reliable. So how much intermittency how much intermittent sources should be a part of that diversification of the grid?
My answer on this is whatever the market will bear in the absence of subsidies. I think that if we remove all of the market distortions, the market will decide and the market will probably choose reliability. But I'm comfortable with whatever the market will bear as long as the market has not been distorted.
I think it's a great answer.
Totally agree with that.
Yeah. Typical free market thinking to come up with that. Yeah, but it's a good one. Before we get into PJMs, I do want to talk about that a little bit. I want to actually pivot away to just talk about energy more holistically. Arthur, can you talk a little bit more? We're talking about the grid here. Obviously, we're talking about public utilities, but when we think about Pennsylvania energy, it's more than just the electric grid. It's the products that are coming from conventional oil drillers, just as yourselves. Can you talk about a little bit more of the energy profile of what Pennsylvania is providing, not just Pennsylvanians and Americans, but globally, if we can expand into those kinds of markets?
I can speak to my own experience, and that is our oil is unique in Pennsylvania. Our oil goes to the world's oldest continuously operating refinery because it's great lubricating quality. So interestingly, you can't run wind turbines without our oil because they go in the crankcase. Our oil goes to locomotives. Our oil goes to the crankcases of all the cargo ships that are moving the cargo around the world. And this maybe isn't exactly responsive, but here's something that ought to be dismaying to us. That oil is out there in the ground. I own tens of thousands of acres of undrilled acreage that I've accumulated over the years. Basically picked up a lot of it cheaply because the industry is being driven out of business. So the world's oldest continuously operating refinery used to receive all of its oil from this basin, from the Appalachian Basin right here in Pennsylvania and Ohio. And that was true for 150 years plus until about 8 years ago. And now that refinery is reaching to places as far away as Utah and Canada, to bring in its oil, and that oil is available right here in Pennsylvania. So that's the way I would respond to you, is it's almost criminal that it's underneath our feet here, and the refinery is paying $5 and $6 and more per barrel to truck it in or bring it in on cargo train elsewhere. It's not exactly responsive to your products question. I'll just touch on that briefly. We're very proud that our products go into hospitals in terms of all the equipment in hospitals. You look around, it's plastics. We're very proud that our natural gas heats all of your homes. Whatever surplus there is. Do you know where fertilizer comes from? You can probably tell from me talking about natural gas, but through the Haber-Bosch process, 95% of the world's fertilizer comes from natural gas. We wouldn't be able to eat as we do. In fact, we would be, half the population would starve. If you're a fan of a gentleman named Vaclav Smil, S-M-I-L. He's a great author and has got a zillion books out there. He's just a great scientist. He'll tell us that half the world's population would starve without natural gas. So we're very proud of those things.
Well, and I think when we look to, 80% of the world's energy in some form comes from some type of a hydrocarbon. So when we talk about this energy transition, with that, 80%, that's quite a lot. So I think when we talk about net zero versus 100% abundance, it's going to require some pretty strong regulations. Some might say even draconian kind of regulations to rid the world of its 80% hydrocarbon usage. I think that's when we talked about the individual versus collectivism. I think this is part of the fundamental questions that we all have to be answering. So let's pivot to utilities. Let's talk about PJM. We've heard that a lot. We've talked about it. It came up yesterday. So real quick, so PJM is our regional transmission operator and RTO. What are RTOs? RTOs pretty much came about previously. How public utilities worked is you had what was called a vertically integrated monopoly, where you had one company or one entity which owned everything from the generation all the way up to the electricity that was going into your home. Then you flip on the switch, and there's some places in the United States where a vertically integrated model is, and they haven't. But what happened through deregulation is they created something called RTO and energy markets, which is what we find ourselves here in Pennsylvania and part of the PJM market. But what we've seen now, again because of some public policies, is that what was a free market solution to a vertically integrated monopoly has essentially become farms for harvesting subsidies. And they're supposed to be prioritizing reliability, supposed to be prioritizing least cost generation, and that's not really what's happening. We heard about the PJM markets. It's like 800 times the price went up in the most recent capacity market. That's a problem, and that's a problem for affordable energy. So let's unpack PJM a little bit, or just the RTOs more broadly. What can we say about what we're experiencing here in Pennsylvania and what we're seeing in RTOs more in general?
I think kind of the first thing to mention is that if you want reliable energy, you want to be in a vertically integrated, and if you want affordable energy, you want to be in an RTO. But it's hard to get both. We don't really have a model that provides both. And so ideally there would be a different construction entirely that would allow for both of those things to exist kind of in the same place at the same time. But the main kind of drawback of the RTO system is just that the auction system doesn't lend itself to rewarding accurately the benefits of various technologies, and that it's easily marred by subsidies. And a little bit of subsidy goes a long way to kind of meddling with an RTO. And that's what PJM, I think, has been experiencing.
Nobody wants it. Well, what I will say is at the Commonwealth Foundation, if you go actually to commonwealthfoundation.org, you can see our recently released energy policy platform. We laid out several broad philosophical principles that we think are applicable in all 50 states and at the national level of how we should think about energy policy. So they're more philosophical in nature. There's about 7 of those. But then we offered 5 specific policy solutions to Pennsylvania lawmakers, among which one was suggesting to look at the RTO system. And is this something that is working for us? Is it something that should be reformed? Should Pennsylvania consider pulling itself out of PJM or not? And I do think these are serious conversations we need to have when we are thinking about energy reliability and also affordability. What is working, what isn't, and let's work on reform. There's lots of things we can do. We talked about permitting reform, and that's obviously been a major hurdle for pipeline infrastructure, but also for the build out of nuclear. The amount of hoops that nuclear power facilities have to go through, that's one of the reasons they've been pretty much regulated almost out of existence. Can you speak a little bit, Alex, about the particular regulatory hurdles and government red tape that's faced by the nuclear industry, maybe not just in Pennsylvania, but broadly across the country?
As best I can. And on the PJM part, I mean, one of the areas that we've been actively engaged with them recently is on the interconnection queue, and having a metric there that is based off of the reliability factor. And because reliability is becoming such an issue, you should be jumping them in the queue to be a priority. So that's something for like our facility at 3 Mile Island. We want to make sure that we're able to get that interconnected onto the queue, and we want to make sure that that energy is making its way out onto the grid. Certainly, nuclear is a heavily regulated industry. That is not something we fight, but it is the fact of what we work with.
We'll fight that for you, don't worry.
But there are certainly ways that we can streamline the process. And when we look at new nuclear development, I think when we talked about preserving what we have, part of that is also extending their lifetimes. All the nuclear power plants got a 40-year license to operate, and most of us have already gone through a subsequent license renewal of 20 years. Some plants are going after an additional subsequent license renewal now and putting these plants out to 80 years. So this is extending the lifetime of these plants, which, when we talk about the costs of building new, wouldn't it be better to just keep these plants chugging along? We maintain them at a very high degree, and that's a part of that strict regulations to make sure the industry regulates itself on this regard to make sure that these plants are safely operating and maintained to such a degree that when our 40-year license is up, we can get a 20-year license to run even another 20 years, and we can do it another 20 years. And then the other part of it is the uprates at the facilities and having the opportunity, to squeeze the rock a little bit harder and be able to draw more energy out of the uranium that we're using as our fuel. These systems are getting more efficient. Things like the AP1000 or the SMRs that are out there now probably have a better efficiency than the systems that we have existing. And there's real opportunities with new nuclear, but it's a cost factor. And we saw the cost factors that came for Vogtle 3 and 4. Although even when you compare the two of them, Vogtle 3 was way more expensive than Vogtle 4 because they were able to streamline some of their processes as they learned and were able to make efficiencies from 3 to 4. And it's one of the factors that holds back nuclear right now is that hesitancy to be first of a kind. Because the general accepted knowledge is that the first of a kind is going to be really expensive to do. And so there is, there are conversations going on. The tech industries have all kind of announced, I think it was Google, Microsoft, and one of the other ones, all kind of combining their resources to support a sort of broader nuclear build and growth, because if you're building 6 at a time, that's no longer first of a kind. It's 6 at first. And that reduces those costs. So there's some real opportunities there. It's going to come from the industry. It's going to come from support from the government. And it's going to require a pooling of knowledge to make it a viability. And you need the support from the RTOs to know that they're going to be able to connect into their grids.
I think keeping existing nuclear online is incredibly important, and kind of a few points on that are the NRC has done a fairly poor job in recent years of ensuring that those subsequent license renewals are allowed to go on. They're engaged in a rulemaking process right now that involved, revoking subsequent license renewals for Peach Bottom and for another plant that they had already issued, and kind of pausing them while they kind of work through their new process, and a process that will make it more onerous to get those later renewals. And I think that that's sort of a misstep from them at a time where we need more baseload, not less. And the other thing is that the 80-year limit it's a limit that was decided, when the NRC came about. It's not a limit that's been determined by the actual long-livedness of reactors. And so hopefully, as the first reactors begin to reach those 80-year limits, it could be reassessed to see, what their actual lifespan limit is, what you can replace to make a reactor last longer even than the 80-year limit that was sort of initially set. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'd like to compare our nuclear reactors to the B-52. That's an airframe that will be flying in our skies for 100 years. And when the B-52 was designed in World War II, nobody really thought that it was going to be able to extend its lifetime this long, but they're showing that they can, and really without a whole lot of effort. And I think that our reactors are in a similar situation. There's a bit of a ship of Theseus there, where we're constantly replacing parts and upgrading and making maintenance, but at its core, I couldn't know the word. I wasn't trying to. But at its core, the nuclear reactor is the same thing that it was when it was first built. And we're just finding that with proper maintenance, these are very long-lived systems.
Concrete lasts longer than valves. You can switch out a lot of valves before you have to replace concrete.
Well, and it's interesting too, because technological innovation, just advancements in technology, not only increase the demand for energy, which we're seeing, which is why we need to increase our baseload, but it's also improve the industry. And while there may not be something specifically with a clean energy label, we have been able to do energy more cleanly. Everything from scrubbers we talked about earlier. Obviously, nuclear is the most reliable zero carbon emitting source that we have. Natural gas, the IFO data here in Pennsylvania has shown that our emissions have gone down tremendously because of natural gas. So we have become a cleaner, and we do it the cleanest here in the United States. So I think one of the things I've heard is that from this panel is that one of the cheapest ways to make energy more affordable is to use the infrastructure that we currently have, and we've done that by making our not just our coal and natural gas facilities more clean in how they're dealing with emissions, but also how we're extracting product. We do this far cleaner than anywhere else, and our regulations are not always the silver bullet, but because of some of the environmental regulations that we do have, we are more environmentally conscious. But I definitely think using our existing infrastructure, both in transmission, distribution, and generating facilities, certainly makes, from a least cost perspective, that makes sense. Let's keep those online. Let's do it better. I want to pivot to the audience for some Q&A. We have some time here. This gentleman right here has his hand first up. Are you going to sing for us your question?
Absolutely not.
Yeah. Take it easy.
Do you have oil on the brain?
I do have oil. As a matter of fact, Andre, thank you. Because this question is specifically for Arthur. Arthur, you talked about the amount of oil that's still left in the ground here in western Pennsylvania, and some would forget about that. This is Drake Well, it's an oil well, not a natural gas well. And I'd like to know why you think. Growing up around here, it was always the rule of thumb: when the price of a barrel of oil hits $80, $84, then the pump jacks start going in the woods around western Pennsylvania. That's no longer the case. So I'd like to get an answer from you, your perspective, why United Refinery has had to stop using Pennsylvania grade crude. Why aren't we pulling it out of the ground here? What's your reason?
So the truth is that oil and gas are finite resources. The reason United doesn't use it is because United refines 60,000 barrels a day. Pennsylvania produces under 10,000 barrels a day, so they have to bring in every drop from Canada. And as goes Pennsylvania, so will go shale fields in the not distant future. And so while we talk about cheap energy and energy abundance, and we talk about Pennsylvania being the leader for all those things, I think we have to do it with a modicum of realism as well. And I like your question. So oil and gas are so energy dense that they are essentially a magic fuel. There's enough calories in a barrel of oil to represent human labor that's almost 5 years in length. And we undervalue it beyond description. We all grew up with it, so we take it for granted that when we pull up to quick fill, it's going to be full. They can fill up your car. So this is a wandering way to say to you that we're not pumping it out of the ground here because we're not getting paid enough for it, because we don't treasure it enough. And we have so screwed up the system with subsidies and whatnot that the economics of it don't work for a company like mine. They don't work for a lot of companies because these crazy subsidies are falling like raindrops out of the sky on wind and solar. So I just want to close with this thought. If we took energy more preciously, as we should, we would conserve it more. I'm not a person to go out and say we should be using it with abandon, we should be driving 6 mile per gallon cars. I think it's a much more precious resource that will, oil and gas are far better than wind and solar could ever be, and we should treasure it, we should husband it, and we're not, because we're actually creating policies that cause exactly the opposite. We have disdain for oil and gas, and therefore we devalue it. I don't know if that makes any sense. I'd love to talk about it more, but it's a little hard to convey that concept in the short amount of time we have.
Yeah, I don't want to hog the mic. I think I was just shut off there. But I would like to talk to you a little bit more about that, because is there that much change in subsidies that 15 years ago you still had independent oil producers making a good living producing oil out of the ground here in Pennsylvania, especially 15, 20 years ago, with much lower prices of oil, what made it less economical?
I'll answer you directly, and I promise I'll do it in 30 seconds or less. So we used to take our company to Canada fishing as a way of team building, and then we had to stop when oil prices collapsed in 2014, and my staff would always say, when are we going back to Canada? And I always say to them, when oil hits $75 a barrel, we'll be able to afford to go to Canada. Now oil's at $75 a barrel, we can't afford to go to Canada. Here's why. When Biden came into office, my casing cost $9.55 a foot. Today it costs $15. So that 50% increase is the same inflation everybody else is suffering. Had to pay my employees 30% more in the last 3 years just to keep them on the payroll. So what used to be $50 oil is now $120 oil.
That's a good answer for a simple man like me.
Right here.
A simple singer.
Victoria. Right here.
Thank you. I'm sorry I'm not being rude. I have a gimpy knee, so that's why my foot is up. Victoria Coates, I work for the Heritage Foundation. Stephanie, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the regional impact of retiring baseload production, which is already happening and will only accelerate if RGGI is fully implemented in PA, depending on what the Supreme Court decides to do. And I noted with great joy, I'm sure, Andre, you did as well, that the Pennsylvania Senate passed sort of a prohibition on RGGI. Now it'll go to the House and get shot down, but depending on what happens in November, we might be able to make some more progress on that. But the problem I see is, yes, this is a problem for Pennsylvania, but it could be a bigger problem for our region, given their reliance on our power exports.
So RGGI is a tricky subject for me to answer. API sort of stayed outside the fray and that whole policy debate, but I can tell you the politics of it with Governor Shapiro appealing the Commonwealth Court decision. Basically, the Commonwealth Court, the case was filed there questioning the constitutionality of RGGI, and the Commonwealth Court did rule in favor of those plaintiffs that said we believe it's not constitutionally sound, because the legislature is the one that needs to make decisions like this, not the executive branch, not the regulatory branch. So Governor Shapiro then appealed that to the state Supreme Court on the basis of his executive powers. He wants to make sure that executive powers are preserved. We don't know when there's going to be a decision from the state Supreme Court on that, so of course RGGI's on pause here in Pennsylvania until ultimately there's a decision there. So from a policy perspective, when you look at energy policy in Pennsylvania, I am predicting you're not going to see anything on any kind of energy policy until RGGI is, until a resolution is arrived at for RGGI.
Yeah, and I think it is who in their right mind would put iron in the ground when you're not sure what the future is going to be, when you're going to be taxed out of existence. Because RGGI fundamentally is it's a carbon tax, so it's a cap and tax system where power generators are told what their emission cap is, and then for everything after that you get taxed for additional trade. And RGGI's a regional impact, so it's not just Pennsylvania. But then if that wasn't good enough, there's a new policy, because when isn't there an abundance of policy instead of energy? But there's another one called PACER, and that is essentially a state-based cap and tax system. So if RGGI wasn't bad enough to do in the region, this is a make Pennsylvania great again policy by taxing it individually instead of entering a regional compact. So again, these are policies that are specifically targeting oil and gas, specifically targeting reliable baseload power generating facilities and trying to regulate them out of existence. And so I think these are some of the policy hurdles when we're thinking about baseload generation. It's not just the subsidies that are poisoning the energy markets of how we deal with price signals for baseload generation. That's a major problem, but it's also these cap and tax policies that who in their right mind, again, if you're a power generator, would build a power plant when you might get regulated out of existence.
Even if it never takes effect, it'll have a chilling factor.
Well, it already has.
Yeah, like if you're making investment decisions when there's a looming tax or a looming ban, the Biden export ban on natural gas, anything like that, just knowing that it's looming and it's likely is going to change the marketplace on its own, whether or not it ever takes effect.
Right here.
I appreciate a lot of the comments, especially on permitting reform. I think that's the key to unlocking a lot of these things. So if you can deal with permitting reform, you can have more sort of fuel versus fuel, technology versus technology competition. But I want to push back on the subsidy debate a little bit, because IRA also includes very significant subsidies for nuclear power, which we're all advocating as a good thing. So I'm curious what the panel thinks about the appropriateness of that. And that also gets into a related issue, which is nuclear versus gas competition. Right, it's not just nuclear and gas versus renewables, there's also gas change the dynamic for nuclear as well. So I'm curious what you all think about the nuclear subsidies and
Okay. Yeah, I'll just chime in real quick. So I'd say I'm certainly in favor of reliable energy and affordable energy. Nuclear certainly can provide base load. So I'm in favor of nuclear in the base load capacity it can provide, but I'm certainly not in favor of subsidies for anybody. So I think actually what we've seen with 3 Mile Island, with the partnership that's happening between Constellation, Microsoft is a free market solution that industry wants it. There's demand. We can do it without subsidies. So for me personally, to answer that, I think Paige probably want to answer this too. But I would just say that we should be leveling the playing field where everyone should compete equally on grounds of reliability without government putting its thumb on the scale with subsidies or picking winners and losers. We know what the grid needs to stay online, and let all sources compete to do that.
I agree completely. I understand that they are asking for a loan guarantee for that project.
Sure,
So
and things just like everything else that we'll watch it and see what's going on. But what I will say from where I stand at the Commonwealth Foundation, we believe in reliable, affordable energy. We would certainly not agree with subsidies for anybody.
Yeah, I will happily get rid of any type of subsidy contained in the IRA. No hesitation.
You're the man hot seat here.
All right, Alex, come on in.
I will draw the ire of everyone here. But look, it goes back to my comment I made before, is that if you're going to have a reliable system, the reality is that the government plays a role in that. Whether we want to admit it or not, it has to. TMI shut down because of market factors, because the free market, quote unquote, was doing its thing. And what happened was there was a glut of natural gas, and it pushed down energy prices. The reality is that the energy market is not a free market. It's a very competitive wholesale market where the PJM is going to decide which ones based off of who can provide it at what price. The consumer doesn't pick their energy. The consumer just gets what's given to them. So it's hard to look at the whole market and say, well, we should just let the free markets do what it's going to do. You're not going to get a reliable energy grid by letting the market just do what it does, because you're going to see these fluctuations. This is similar to OPEC when they put their thumb on the scale. It's a similar concept here, and what the IRA is doing for nuclear is providing a baseline. We don't get rich off of the credits that come from the federal government from that. If it falls below a certain threshold, we stay alive. If it goes above, we don't get anything. And I don't think that is unjust riches for an industry. I think that's making sure that they can remain a viable industry. And on the point of TMI going after a loan guarantee, it's a loan. I got to pay that back. I couldn't afford the house I live in right now, except the fact that I took out a loan to do it. We're going to have to pay that back, and I suspect with interest. So, again, this is the markets at work. These things aren't free and they're not cheap. And for us to be able to bring 3 Mile Island back online, it's a $1.6 billion investment. That's a significant amount of money. And, we talked about this before, we didn't have to shut it down except for the fact that the market forced us out. So this is money that shouldn't have been spent, but is going to be. So, I understand the positions of my colleagues to my left and right, and I feel their squeeze on me right now. The reality is that, this was necessary, to ensure that we do have a reliable grid and that we can provide for everyone in this building the electricity demands that they have.
Sure. Well, and thank you all for that. Thank you for your questions. I know we're coming to the end. If you can just indulge me for 1 minute, I just want to give everyone an opportunity to have, if anyone wants a lightning round real quick, any final thoughts? Go.
Energy is on the ballot. That's all I'm going to say.
Anybody else? Arthur, do you have anything, Paige? Okay.
Real quick, if you look around this museum, we used to be heroes. One day again, we will be heroes because you need us. It gets tiresome going to work every day and feeling like folks are wanting to spit on you, but you use our products, you ought to recognize you use our products, and we look forward to the day we're heroes again.
The Simpsons is a poor representation of the nuclear industry.
The pink donuts are great. You're good? All right, well, thank you all so much.
Okay,
Thank you.
great.